Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on cyber resilience for now and tomorrow. I'm Stuart Elston, and I'm the Principal BDM at Freeths, and I'm responsible for stakeholder engagement. So thank you for joining us this morning. Now, over the next hour, you will hear from a specialist cybersecurity expert, Richmond-Coggan, who is one of Freeths' cybersecurity and data protection lawyers, and Mark Brannigan, Head of Cyber Solutions at Aon. Now, they're going to cover a range of topics under cyber resilience. In more or less, there'll be business implications of not being cyber resilient, practical steps, and also what are the appropriate safeguards really protecting against. So there'll be a lot of discussion around that. And obviously, this is an interactive session, so please do join in where possible. But unfortunately, one of our other panel members, Simon from CRMG, was no longer able to make it and had to pull out this morning at short notice. So we will proceed, and those areas mentioned in the invitation will be covered. So at least you get to hear from two exceptional cybersecurity experts that do make the most of, obviously, their knowledge and expertise. Now, in this hour, as mentioned, you can have an opportunity to ask any pressing cybersecurity data protection question that relates to your business, that's impacting your business, or it might be on the horizon of impacting your business. But I thought, what would you do to set the scene this morning for Will, who I'll pass you over to shortly, is that we're going to do a poll. So if you can, please do obviously take time to respond to the poll, and we'll take it from there. So if you just want to obviously fill it in, I'll give you a couple of seconds. And I will end the poll in 10 seconds. So if you haven't already responded, please do. That'd be great. As obviously, we'll use this as the starting basis of our conversation. Okay, I will end the poll. Excellent. Now, in terms of going forward, what we want to do is obviously get you guys to ask as many questions as possible. So please do ask any questions in the Q&A section. Any questions read out will be anonymous, so don't worry, they won't be attributed to you. And if for any other reason you have any technical internet issues and you are taken out of the webinar, please just click on the joining link and you should be able to join us. And any other questions, just use the Q&A session, and Sean, who is the event coordinator, will obviously be there to support you. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Will Richmond-Coggan. Thank you, Will.
Hi, morning everyone. Thanks, Stuart. And let's start with that poll. I'll sort of talk a bit about my experience and sort of relevant involvement in this area in a minute. But just looking at those poll results, 25% of the people responding have suffered a cyber incident within the last month, and a further nearly 40% have suffered one within the last 2 years. And what that illustrates is that if you haven't yet encountered one of these events, it probably is only a matter of time, or you've been particularly lucky, or you've had one and you just don't know that it's happened yet. And this is being borne out increasingly in the experience of our clients and the businesses that we have dealings with, and the people like Aon that we interact with who talk about the same sort of things. It is an enormous area, and it's one that has to some extent been accelerated and exacerbated by the lockdown over the last year. There is statistical evidence that where people have been deprived of the opportunity to pursue what might have been regarded as traditional sort of methods of crime, they have turned more and more to internet criminal activity to carry out hacking or phishing or fraud, to try and obtain some sort of advantage, either in terms of getting access to data or a financial advantage. And that, combined with the fact that people are working or have been working remotely in their own environments rather than in an office environment, perhaps with fewer controls over their IT systems, perhaps with some less direct supervision, sometimes with maybe a bit less attention because they've got other activities going on. They've got homeschooling kids. They've got competition over access to computer because their partner is also trying to work remotely. All of these things have led to a real spike in incidents involving data and IT, and the sort of very broad range of issues that are grouped together as sort of cyber incidents. Where I come into this, I'm a data protection lawyer, and I've worked in the area of data protection for the last sort of 15 years or so. Always really doing a mix of advisory, sort of non-contentious and contentious work. And it's fair to say that up until GDPR coming into force, there was not an enormous amount of demand for sort of bread and butter data protection advice for businesses. A lot of our data protection or privacy work was done for sort of minor celebrities and politicians and people who had concerns about privacy, or businesses where data was their meat and drink, where actually data was their primary commodity, and where therefore they always had to take it a bit more seriously. But I used to get involved in corporate due diligence around data and information security in the days before GDPR. And often it would be a sort of tick box exercise. The client would be asked, are your data protection regime adequate? And they would say, yes, it is. And no one would really worry about it very much beyond that. That has all changed. And part of what's driving that change has been the increase in scrutiny for data protection as a result of GDPR. But the other thing that's driven that change has been an understanding that in the modern world, every business is potentially vulnerable to the sort of disruptive impacts of a data breach or a cyber incident. And that vulnerability has a number of practical implications to the value of the business, to its reputation, and to the way in which it's going to be able to continue to meet its customers' needs. And a few sort of examples, I think, are probably the best way to sort of illustrate this. Firstly, beginning where we started with the poll, I'm involved at the moment in acting for 3 clients, all on very large group litigation cases stemming from data breaches. When I say very large, the breaches in question have involved a number of records being disclosed that range from the high hundreds up to about $750,000 in the largest case. Those records don't contain financial information, so there's no bank details, no credit card information, there's no passports there, no driving license or other ID that might allow for impersonation. These are breaches that include a name, an email address, maybe a physical address, and maybe some other information about that client, that individual as a customer of my client. Nevertheless, even with that relatively small amount of information being disclosed, when those breaches have been notified, it has resulted in 2 main strands of activity. One, an investigation by the Information Commissioner's Office. And so I'm getting quite adept at having conversations with their cyber team, explaining how these incidents have come about, often based off a report that's had to be commissioned in some haste by the client, because you have to make your notification to the ICO within 72 hours of first discovering the breach. And then secondly, following the notifications to the actual data subjects themselves, engaging with solicitors who have been instructed by those individuals to claim compensation. And one of the really big changes that's happened over the last few years has been an enormous rise in the awareness of consumers that any sort of data breach at all might entitle them to perhaps fairly modest compensation, but nevertheless compensation that it's worth their while sort of sticking their hand out for. And it's also fair to say that unfortunately, there's been some fairly bad advice in this area to defendants, which has led to settlements being paid where perhaps they didn't need to be. And that has only further served to encourage those claimants to start, those claimant firms to start circling every time news of a breach arises. So a recent example, I was instructed in connection with a breach earlier this year. We were instructed within about an hour of the breach having been discovered, because the clients knew us and knew that we were able to sort of support them in that early stage. So we were involved in the initial sort of forensic investigation. We saw the reports before they were sort of passed across to insurers, and before they were certainly sort of notified to the ICO. We prepared the submissions to the ICO, and we worked to provide input into the notifications that went out to the data subjects. All of that happened within the first sort of 24, 48 hours of the breach. So it was an enormously sort of busy time. The client was quite fortunate in that they had a fairly robust breach response process already in place. So they were ready to sort of deal with that type of incident, although they hadn't had one before. So the right people were identified, and they were able to deal with it quite swiftly, which meant that we were able to get a very coherent and detailed information pack across the Information Commissioner's Office. And my subsequent engagements with the ICO have been very positive, because they've sort of recognised that the client knew what they were doing and were on top of things. Even so, and even with quite a lot of reassurance that we were able to give to affected customers, they were able to, even in those circumstances, they had an enormous number of customers coming back and immediately saying, I've been very distressed by the notification of this breach, and I want compensation. And this is the sort of pattern. No one waits to see whether they've actually suffered financial harm as a result of a breach. They simply come and they say, I want compensation. I'd like money. And if solicitors are involved, obviously those solicitors firms are also asking for their legal costs. What then happens is that we have to get involved in responding to potentially sort of hundreds of these letters of claim that are coming in. Now, each one, and let's say not this recent example, but one from last year, you know, let's say you've got a breach that affects about 750,000 individuals. You might get off the back of that maybe 1,000 sort of letters of claim. Now that seems like quite a small percentage, and there's a temptation, and this has been some of the advice that other firms have given in the past, temptation to just sort of start paying out compensation to buy off those early complaints at a relatively low value, but we're probably talking hundreds of pounds, so 500, 750 pounds a pop. In each case, the solicitor's firm then comes back and says, oh, we want our costs, and those costs can be eye-watering. We once settled a case for a client, a single individual claim, £750 claimed and paid, and the solicitors then came back and said that for writing us 2 letters, they had incurred £22,000 worth of costs to go along with that. Now, given that the first letter was a template in which they had obviously just copied and pasted their client's name into something standard, we had trouble with that. But at the same time, the client had other things to be doing. They couldn't be embroiled in a really protracted argument over the assessment of costs, so they ended up paying, you know, a few thousand towards the costs. Now, when you've got a single claim, that's one thing, but if you've got even just the 1,000 claimants who are there with their hands out, those numbers can start to ramp up pretty quickly. And of course, if you've got another 749,000 claimants in the background, all of them potentially wanting to come along and make their own claims if they know that compensation is being paid, then obviously that that is a very substantial number indeed, and one that businesses do have to price in. So I don't want to sort of talk too much more about that aspect of it, because there are sort of other considerations that you should be thinking about as well. But I just sort of leave those thoughts with you, because it is something that increasingly, there is a very standard playbook to this. The incident is often discovered on a Friday night. The breach tends to have to be notified on the Monday, and we would generally expect that by the end of that week, so within a week anniversary of the incident having been detected, if notifications have started going out to data subjects, you are going to start to see letters of claim coming in from the same few law firms, often sort of retooled PPI firms, who are there, basically putting out a website, talking about your client, talking about the data breach, often with very little resemblance of any factual accuracy, but still sort of saying to people, oh, you can get thousands in compensation if you've been a victim of this breach. And that's a consideration. That consideration then, of course, feeds through to other areas. One of the other things that I'm spending a lot of my time doing is an increased range of work around due diligence. So when companies are bought and sold, there is now increasing scrutiny on, well, what legacy breaches might we be carrying with us? And that's a result of cases like the Marriott Hotels case from a few years ago. Marriott acquired another hotel chain, a smaller hotel chain, unknown to them and not detected during the due diligence. That other chain was carrying an undetected breach where someone had intruded into their systems and placed software which was diverting customer information, including credit card information, for around 2 years prior to the date of the acquisition. Because Marriott then failed to put in place appropriate protections, which they had in the rest of their group, but they didn't map them onto the new business unit when they acquired it. It was a further 2 years before that breach was detected, and it was Marriott and not the other company, which obviously had been sort of absorbed into Marriott by that point, that ended up picking up a fine of millions from the ICO, and all sorts of reputational damage. A fine which was announced, in the early days of COVID. So it was a sort of double whammy for them at a point where, hospitality industry company, they could ill afford any adverse publicity or anything that might further deter customers from coming to them. So, that due diligence process is becoming a lot more rigorous. And if a buyer finds that there isn't the right level of protection in place around the business, then that is having an impact on price. We are seeing buyers actually sort of gouging on price and saying, well, look, I'm going to have to run, potentially a 6-figure program to bring this new part of the business up to snuff in terms of data protection and the adequacy of information security. And that is an amount which we're not going to pay to you as the vendors, because you have allowed your company to be run in this sort of improper or inadequate way. And then the other way in which it sort of feeds in is, even within the life cycle of a business, it's requiring businesses to be much more careful with who they share their data with. And there's increasingly a requirement around supply chain due diligence, that companies are having to investigate the adequacy of the safeguards that are in place around the protection of information down the supply chain. That's important even within this jurisdiction, but it's particularly important when you're sharing data overseas, because a lot of the mechanisms that make the transfer of personal data to third countries lawful depend on the transferer of that information having actually done some scrutiny of the safeguards that are in place at the other end of the process. And when we talk about safeguards, and this is really sort of the last thing that I'll sort of say before I hand over to Mark, the safeguards are a number of different elements. Firstly, there are what are called technical safeguards. So that is the obvious things, you know, your firewall, antivirus software, user access controls, so digital controls that are implemented to make sure that not everyone in the business has access to every piece of data. Monitoring, so that you're monitoring the integrity of the information and making sure that it's not being manipulated or indeed taken. And then organizational controls, which are things like the rules around, you know, who can give an instruction that money is transferred out of the business's accounts, what level of seniority is needed, what checks and balances are required, and all of these sort of things. But the other element, which is equally important, is that businesses must demonstrate that they have the ability to satisfy any data subject rights that fall to be exercised. And that can be simple things like subject access requests, but it can also be the ability to meet claims and compensation that are validly made by a claimant if, for example, the loss of their credit card information results in fraud, or indeed, in some cases, you know, legitimately, breaches can lead to actionable distress and difficulty for particular individuals who are vulnerable, or where the information disclosed is particularly sensitive. And the company's ability to meet that, as well, of course, as their ability to sort of respond dynamically and in an agile way to an incident as it evolves, does come down, you know, to some extent to the insurance and to the sort of range of arrangements that have been made by the business to answer those sort of incidents when they arise, and the extent to which that policy is actually genuinely responsive to the types of incidents that happen. And just as a sort of a hook to hand over to Mark, I'll say that in one recent case for one of my clients suffering a pretty substantial data breach, it took them the best part of a month even to get the insurers to consider whether or not they would provide cover. And these were not, I hasten to add, insurers that had any connection with Aon. But it took them the best part of a month to even decide whether or not they were going to extend cover for the incident. And when they did, the confirmation was that in fact they weren't going to provide cover. And that wasn't because there wasn't a data protection section within the insurance policy that they were claiming under, but it was because undetected by our client, there was an exception to that policy, which said, yes, you can have protection for data protection incidents, but not where there was any misuse of computers involved. And this was an incident where some third party had hacked into our client's system and had taken some information. And because there was a misuse of computers, the insurers said, I'm sorry, that doesn't get covered by our data protection policy. What you should have is specialist cyber insurance. And that seems like a really good point for me to hand over to Mark. And once Mark's spoken, then we'll have a bit of a discussion and we'll pick up some of the questions that I know are coming in.
Yeah, thanks, Will. I think that is a good point, and you know, we'll come back to that insurance piece in a second. What I want to sort of introduce to the audience today is really starting how you think about cyber and cyber risk to a business. So, you know, within Aon, what we have, just to introduce it, you know, insurance is a big part of what we do, but our cyber solutions team, we have our insurance brokers, we have risk consultants, and we also have our cybersecurity capabilities as well. So we have deep technical expertise in advising clients, both in preventative and response measures. So it's being able to pull these together. So when we look at this, there's a couple of key factors that are always called out with clients. First and foremost, it's important to understand that cyber risk is not an IT risk. It is a business risk. It does have as Will has outlined, you know, legal and regulatory implications. It has financial, operational, and certainly reputational. And Will's touched on a number of those, where we start to talk about how an organization is valued. So these are all important factors. Second one is it is a multi-stakeholder play. I mean, everybody is responsible for cybersecurity in an organization. You know, and I think I'm going to read here a quote recently from the inaugural speech from Lindy Cameron, who is the new CEO of the National Cybersecurity Centre. So in her inaugural speech just a month ago, you know, one of the points that she made is that for business leaders, she makes is in boardrooms, digital literacy is as non-negotiable as financial or legal literacy. This is highlighting the importance to understand this risk. And I think that's the sort of key piece that we can do. And I'll come back to another quote that she makes about insurance when we come onto that in a second. If we then, you know, expand on the backdrop that Will had provided about what's been happening in the market. So, you know, there's a multitude of statistics out there, but if we sort of look at, you know, sort of cutting through those, there's a number of different types of attacks, but if we take one that is getting the headlines at the moment, you know, because it is the most prevalent of attacks, which is ransomware, you know, in the last 12 months, and I'll touch on the reasons we believe why, but no, throughout COVID, there has been, you know, upwards of a 400% increase in ransomware attacks on organizations. You know, I know that within our own organization, dealing with, you know, speaking to our own security function, you know, we would sort of mirror that. But we're seeing that, you know, coming from the NCSC, coming from other data sources. So there's a significant uptick in the volume of activity that we're seeing. But tied to that, we're also seeing, you know, an increase in the severity of how these things are playing out. And that is translating, and also I will come back to this in a second, that is translating into the insurance market. You know, so we'll sort of talk about what's happening there and then also what we can sort of do about that. So we are seeing this. And if we look at the sort of root causes of why that's happening, couple of reasons. You know, certainly the COVID situation has provided an opportunity for the cyber gangs to attack. You know, the wholesale work from home sort of movement has led to an increase in the vulnerabilities or the sort of the entry points into the organization. You know, a lot of organizations have been under severe stress, and they are looking for that. You know, Will mentioned, you know, that it's not lost on people that most attacks happen on a Friday night or another key point of stress in an organization. You know, they are deliberately sort of tasked. If you look at the ransomware gangs themselves, over the last you know, number of years, there's been a blurring of lines between their sort of their sort of tactics, their techniques. There's a blurring line between the motivations, how they're doing that between nation states, criminal gangs, and hacktivists. So, you know, we're seeing their sort of methodologies starting to merge. You know, a lot of the ransomware gangs, there is a very close association with some nation state attackers, which means that, you know, the recourse, you know, it's very hard to sort of come by. But the way the sort of tactics that they're using to extort data, you know, so, you know, many years ago it would be, I've locked up your data, you know, pay the ransom and we'll uncrypt it. You know, we'll give it back to you. You know, there's some complications now they're saying, oh, we'll leak some of this. You know, we'll put it on the dark web. You know, they're engaging directly with the press to say that this has happened to your organization, because they're finding this to be an effective way. You know, from their business motivation is to get paid the ransom, right? So they're using it as an effective way to not only get paid the ransom, but also to get a bigger payout. You know, so that they know they can extort it, which is why they choose their timings. You know, they are often in the organization for a while. They know what's going on. They know the weak points. You know, if you're, for example, it's a real sort of peak point for retail organizations will be around Black Friday and then the Christmas sort of sale period. You know, they're going to pick on this. You know, in M&A transaction activity, you know, you've got a lot of the business leadership will be under a lot of stress anyway. So that's when it will happen. So the impacts of these can be very real. But also what we've also seen is that there has been, I suppose, additional, there's no decrease in the effect on data privacy, but looking at the types of impact, data privacy is still very real and still a big impact that we have here. But we also need to consider business interruption. You know, a lot of the losses that we're seeing at client end, you know, and we've got a couple of clients who have been through this in the last 6 months at the moment. We're seeing that the business interruption costs are outweighing the cost of the ransom. You know, there is a data privacy aspect in a number of these cases, and that's both a short and medium, and potentially even long-term risk to the organization. But the real the shock that hits them is the inability to actually trade. It's the cost associated with getting back up and running. These can run into the 7 figures quite quickly. When you look at an average mid-market sort of sector, the cost of a major cyber incident can be anywhere between 3 and 15%. Now, this was according to a study by Grant Thornton a couple of years ago. So you can see it can have quite a significant impact, and not least when you have organizations in the current climate that are under a lot of stress. But the other factor that I think is contributing to this has been the move to digitization. So it's not just systems that contain consumer data. The attackers are attacking, the supply chain. They're attacking, the business process. So that could be warehouse management systems. They're locking those up, and this is where we can start to see some of the more devastating end of the attacks. Primarily because these things take longer to recover from. To reconfigure, to re-implement these things, to understand if you've got an inventory of hundreds of thousands or millions of items. Being able to sort of recompile that is a significant task, and this is all starting to add up. So you can sort of see that at the moment there's from the criminal gangs perspective, there is a bit of a perfect storm that's happening at the moment. So, but if we sort of move on, and what I'll do is I'll talk a bit about what's happening in the cyber insurance market, but also how security intersects with that. So, taking a step back again around the cyber insurance market. This is a market that has been evolving over a number of years, and it's evolving in response to what's happening with our clients. So back in sort of 2017, we saw the WannaCry, NotPetya, and attacks, indiscriminately affecting a number of large organizations globally. What had happened there is not many organizations had standalone or what's known as affirmative cyber cover. So cover was included in their property or under a computer crime sort of policy, or their E&O or their PI and so forth. But that's where the claims piece was starting to cause some contention. So as of January the 1st, 2020 rather, the PRA and the Lloyd's of London have been making big moves towards what's known as affirmative cover. So taking silent cyber out of it, so where cyber is included within other covers, to have a standalone cyber policy that will respond to the incidents that you're faced. And that's a really important point, is to not make that assumption that because you've got some cover somewhere else that it's going to respond, as to Will's point earlier. So making sure that will respond is absolutely key. If we fast forward, over the last 12 months, and in line with that increase in attacks, we've seen an increase in the claims that are being made. Organizations are being impacted. This is costing them millions, which is transferring or translating down to the underwriting community, to the insurers, and they're sort of hitting losses for the first time. So of course, when they're looking at how they underwrite their risks, they're looking to make sure that they are they're writing good risks. And in a cyber sense, the thing that's really changed over time, so rates are hardening, so it's getting more expensive, but you've got to balance that with the value that it brings, given the impact it can have in the organization. So some people would say that the market is just sort of writing itself in terms of the costs to the benefit. But when organizations are placing that, this is where cybersecurity is becoming more important. I think the intersection between the insurance and the security world is getting very, very sort of tightly aligned. Is the underwriters are asking more directed questions. They want to know what mitigation controls you have in place. What you have from a preventative perspective, whether that's open ports that you might have, the way you've expanded to remote working very quickly. They want to know that that environment is secured. They want to know that you're using what's considered, I would consider fairly sort of basic cyber hygiene factors, like using multi-factor authentication. There's still a bit of resistance in clients. It's a bit of a procedural change. So people people generally don't like change. But it has been shown, if we look at the claims data, the incident response data that we have, that these are factors that actually help prevent the likelihood of an attack happening. And that's important. In a recent roundtable we had with Eric Friedberg, who's the founder of the sort of Stroz Friedberg that Aon collected, acquired back in 2016. When we sort of look at most of the attacks that we respond to, 99% of them occur through known vulnerabilities. So these are things that are known to the criminal gangs, that they know that if they do this, then they are likely to get in. So what that suggests is that good basic cyber hygiene is a really important factor to help people sort of mitigate some of this. The other factors that they will look for are, these are what I sort of consider as sort of focusing on reducing the impact of this, is what your internal mitigation controls are. So they will want to know, what sort of training you've been given to your people. Are you running regular, tabletop exercises with your board to know how to respond to that? Because that can be shown to have a significant impact in reducing the costs associated with that. What your storage architecture looks like. They're getting quite detailed around that. So are you logically and physically segmenting your data? Are you encrypting your data at rest and in transit? Are your backups separated from that environment? So they're asking a lot of these sort of questions to make sure that should something happen, and I think there's unfortunately an acceptance that there is an inevitability around a cyber incident will happen to you at some stage. But these are all controls about mitigating the impact of that. So if they get into one part of the business, make sure that they can't easily get into the next part of the business. It was described to me by one of our security advisory colleagues recently that even with very large, sophisticated organizations, their security posture is a bit like an M&M in that they've got a hard outer shell, but it's quite soft once you're in the inside. So, and then it's once they're in the inside and they can make these lateral movements is where we're seeing the impacts. So these are the sort of things that are sort of happening in the market. This is, to Will's point when we sort of handed over, with that client, it's important to understand that your insurance policy is going to respond to the types of incident. So consider it, is it data privacy, impact? Is it a business interruption? Very much at the moment, we're seeing a lot of activity around the third party or supply chain. So it's making sure that your insurance policy will respond to that. But to get the insurance policy in place or even renewed, if you even have one now, it's important to make sure that you have got a maturing risk posture, that you understand your risk, you are taking active steps to mitigate it. And again, Will has alluded to when you get into that point, or should you ever have to go through a regulatory investigation, they're going to ask questions about what controls you had in place. So it's better to have them in place in the first place, because that will mitigate some of that type of risk there. But it's once you've understood those, that's where you look at the mitigations. It's how do we improve our security controls? Let's make sure that we have got the appropriate insurances in place to protect the balance sheet. And let's make sure that we're staying on top of this. So I think with that, Will, I think we've had a couple of questions come through. And I think one of them, sort of builds directly there. So I can see one saying, given the immediate response nature of data breaches, do you work on a retainer pricing structure? But maybe I can sort of step back a little bit there. Just talking about preparing for a cyber incident, preparedness is absolutely key. So if you think about it, you've got to develop that muscle memory of how to respond. So the organization, including key stakeholders, and this is business stakeholders, not just IT stakeholders, I can't emphasize that enough, need to know what to do, how to respond in there. One of those key elements would be considered best practice would be to have outside counsel, have incident responders, potentially have PR, depending on the nature of your business, have those on retainer. As Will talked about, one of these incidents, if there's a data privacy or a data breach happening on a Friday night, the GDPR 72-hour clock starts ticking once you know about it. It makes absolute common sense to engage your outside counsel very, very quickly. And an outside counsel that's working in conjunction with an incident responder, that they know how to work so they can actually respond and engage quickly, because those first 72 hours are critical from obviously minimizing potential ongoing legal and regulatory impact, but also getting to grips with what's happening to your business, how it's happened, and start to make informed decisions on how to mitigate.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. I mean, the question of retainer is one that varies from client to client, and I've never yet said no to a Friday night call just because we weren't on retainer with that client. I mean, sometimes they're not people that we've ever worked with before, but it is. I mean, it's so much more of a challenge to get on top of all of these things, because those clocks don't stop ticking because it's the weekend. And so we're all of us sort of pulling out all the stops on a Saturday and a Sunday. And if I'm simultaneously having to get to know the client, and if the client is simultaneously having to work out internally, well, actually, who is the right person to be dealing with this? I've sometimes been through incident responses where in the first 48 hours, 3 different people have assumed the lead of the incident response within the client. And that is a recipe for things getting missed and for confusion and for delay. That just contributes to everyone's stress, but it also ultimately means that the response is going to be less effective. But more importantly, I think, than having some sort of retainer arrangement is, at a minimum, having that sort of thing that Mark was talking about, the regular sort of, whether it's tabletop, whether it's something a bit more involved, but a sort of an assessment of how ready are we? Let's say a breach is happening right now. Who are we going to call? What are we going to do? Who needs to be involved? And actually involving them and saying to them, right, let's say I had a breach right now. What would be the next steps? And that's something that we do work on quite a lot with clients, and it does pay enormous dividends if something sort of comes up. And I've had these conversations with clients who sort of say, well, but we've never had a breach. Why would we need to do this? And the answer to that is, exactly the same as the reason why you do fire drills, even though you've never had a fire. It's so that if ever the worst happens, everyone is moving safely and orderly towards the exit, rather than running around and trying to grab all their personal belongings and clogging up the wrong stairwell or using the lifts when they shouldn't be, and all of these sort of things. It's just a sensible precaution. And obviously, the more flammable your building is, the more that information and an IT, functional IT infrastructure matters to your delivery as an organization, the more seriously you should be taking that. It's a really good example that Mark sort of mentioned about logistics and warehousing. Probably the worst data breach that I've ever had to deal with for a client was one which involved they were a sort of middleman logistics business, and they were storing stock for a number of very significant sort of customers who were using them for customer satisfaction. So effectively they were the last point before shipping out to deliver to customers. And they had a ransomware attack. Someone who'd been on their system for 3 weeks, gradually escalating their privileges, so getting more and more deeply embedded into the systems. And in the end, someone probably triggered, made them think they were about to get caught. So they basically let loose a ransomware thing that encrypted their whole system. They were offline for a week, and by the end of it, they'd lost about 25% of their major customers because they just couldn't tell them what stock they had in their warehouse or organize shipping of it. They were having to have people go around with clipboards and pens doing a manual inventory of all of their warehouse capacity.
Yeah, no, it's we're seeing that. I see another question that's come in saying, what proportion of your clients have cyber insurance cover in place at the time of a incident breach? There's a couple of statistics. So just a few weeks ago, the DCMS, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, in their 2021 cyber breach survey, they surveyed some 4,000 organisations, and between the sort of mid and enterprise level, it's around sort of 17 to 20%. I mean, I can proudly say that the average portion of our clients within Aon is higher than that, that they can do that. What I will also say slightly, but only slightly tongue-in-cheek, is that there is a higher percentage of organisations who want to get cyber insurance in place after a breach or incident, when they realise that how effective it can be. And that's an important point to sort of consider, because one of the features of a good cyber insurance policy is actually the breach response services. Give you access to a pre-vetted, experienced set of breach coaches, responders, whether that's outside counsel, incident response, PR, ransomware negotiators. If you take ransomware in itself, it's fraught with challenge, and how to manage that. They often give you a very short space of time. They're hitting you hard. They're using extortion tactics, but knowing how to respond to them is important. So having an outside counsel who can help guide you. I mean, the payment of the ransom itself, very grey area, I would say, certainly in the eyes of the law, in terms of sort of paying sort of terrorists and so forth. Sourcing Bitcoin, which they often want the payment in, can be quite difficult. But also understanding, this is where knowing how and when to engage with law enforcement or having access to threat intelligence is important. So understanding, being able to recognize quickly what type of malware or ransomware has affected you, what type of, who the gang might be. Actually, that intelligence will certainly help with how to respond to that, both in terms of the negotiation with the ransom payment, but also technically how to respond. There are a number, particularly the RYUK ransomware gang, are notorious for sort of booby trapping certain areas where, should you do something, it gets worse. So, being able to quickly recognize those signs and, again, contain the blast radius is absolutely critical. So at the moment, it's about 20%, I think, on average, to answer the sort of question. We can certainly see that increasing over the next couple of years to be a sort of more sensible, sort of more mainstream level of coverage.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the same sort of percentage that I'm seeing. The percentage of clients who think they've got adequate insurance is higher. Yeah. But unfortunately, as I've sort of said earlier, the proof of the pudding tends to be that it doesn't cover as much as they were expecting it to. And that's almost invariably where they haven't taken out sort of specialized cover, but got some sort of general policy that they think extends to that type of incident. Mark, there's another question which I wondered if you wanted to just comment on. As an organization, we've moved all our IT operations to the cloud. Does this mean that we've outsourced the risk to our providers? Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely not. Is the thing. The outsource the risk. You've outsourced the operation. The risk. The impact of that incident still sits with the organisation. So if you think about the risk from a financial impact, a legal or regulatory impact, reputational impacts, operational impacts. It's important to ensure that agreement with the third-party provider is robust and does have provision for the way that you need to respond. You may be able to mitigate some of it through their controls to ensure that they have their. But I think this talks directly to an area that Will first pulled up around third-party and supplier risk. We've recently released the Aon cyber risk survey, and I'm just going to read off here is that third-party risk, only 21% of organisations, this is a global survey, report having baseline measures in place to oversee critical suppliers and vendors. So it's absolutely critical that you do understand the contractual terms that are there, what recourse might be available in those, but don't assume just because they now manage your IT infrastructure that you've outsourced that risk.
Yeah, I once had a client who wanted to complete a due diligence questionnaire around their security with simply the sentence, "It's in AWS, so it's fine." And as you say, there is some benefit to going to one of these big cloud providers who have the economies of scale and the experience to be able to put in place a lot of safeguards. But at the end of the day, it's still your responsibility. And just I can sort of wrap in an answer to another question while we're at it. In the sort of data protection GDPR space, formally speaking, outsourcing storage and processing to a third party doesn't stop you being a controller of the data, and it's the controller of the data who ends up with the liability for compensation claims, but also the liability potentially for fines. And someone's asked the question, you know, when GDPR came in, we were all warned by vendors about massive fines. Yes, I will say, slightly smugly, that I never went around telling everyone that fines were going to be the biggest problem, but a lot of people did, and that was because a lot of people had services to sell that depended on you being really scared about the enormous sort of 4% of turnover fines that were out there. In fact, fines tend to be used a bit more forensically by most of the regulators, and they tend to pick and choose their targets. And if they've got a big name in their sites, British Airways, Marriott, you know, potentially Facebook, with the Irish Data Protection Commissioner going after them at the moment. You know, these are the ones where they'll levy a really big fine, because that gets headlines and it gets the message across to the wider community about the nature of the risk that's going on. I have seen some fines imposed at a lower level, particularly for breaches around you know, bulk calling or bulk emailing without proper consent. So breaches of sort of PECR and things like that. But actually, you know, the fines are few and far between. But for all the reasons that Mark and I have talked about, the fine is not the beginning and end of this. It's an extra factor that you have to bear in mind and you have to be wary of. But actually, and Morrison's supermarket is a really good case. Massive payroll breach a few years ago. ICO investigated. They said all of your safeguards were good. There wasn't really very much you could have done that you didn't do. No fine, no sanction. Didn't stop them being sued by 100,000, or, you know, on behalf of 100,000 employees whose payroll data had been breached. And even though in the end they successfully defended that, not without having been dragged up to the Supreme Court and had, you know, any number of hearings and who knows what in the way of legal fees to defend themselves. And that was all, you know, in circumstances where the ICO said we're perfectly satisfied and no fine follows.
Yeah, we've certainly seen from a number of sort of public profile examples of third-party outsourcers being targeted. You know, if we remember back to the middle of last year, and I don't know if many of you, certainly organisations in the educational sort of charity sector were affected by the Blackboard. It was a company that provides services to them, so that data was attacked. We've had, you know, around Christmas time, sort of coming into the new year, we had SolarWinds, you know, which is a major factor because they're a security application provider. You had Excellion in the US, who are a secure data transfer provider, had been breached, and they're breaching their core systems. But also, you know, more recently, and probably more widespread, still to see the true impact, is the Microsoft Hafnium situation, you know, that's potentially affecting, you know, thousands of organizations that haven't patched, they haven't got that basic cyber hygiene in place, you know, where they've got on-premise, you know, Microsoft Exchange, and they haven't kept their patching regime up to date. That has led to risk there. So I think that just serves to sort of provide an example. It's just because somebody else is operating the infrastructure doesn't mean that the risk doesn't still live with you.
Yeah. Anyone else got any questions before we wrap up? I'm not seeing any more coming through. Anything, Mark, any sort of final thoughts you wanted to?
I think in terms of final thoughts, it's important to reiterate that first and foremost, it's for any organization of size, industry, geographic location, cyber risk is a business risk. You know, it's that acceptance is a really important first step to understand that it will impact you as a business. Second is understanding how it could impact you. You know, is it a data privacy risk? Is it a business interruption? Have you got a third party or a supply chain risk? Understand how it might impact you, both in terms of the impact and the financial implications. But it's also making sure that you then have, you know, cyber risk should be absolutely nailed on as a key factor within your risk register. You should be actively managing it as an organization. I mean, these are all really important controls. And it's the sort of final point is get the basics right. so many organizations still don't have the basics or fully understand what those basics should be. The NCSE has a very good set of toolkits. The Cyber Essentials certification is a really good baseline, but it should be considered a baseline. They should be the bare minimum things that you're doing to understand how you can mitigate the likelihood and the severity of a cyber incident happening to you. And then at the back end is making sure that you have got that preparedness. So make sure that your balance sheet is protected through the appropriate insurance cover, and make sure that you have got a response team internally and externally primed and ready to go and regularly rehearsing, because that's been shown to make a significant difference.
Yeah, I absolutely would echo that. I think there's no substitute for actually thinking through and working through. If we were suffering an incident right now, who would need to be involved and how would we involve them? I'm just going to sort of finish by giving 3 very sort of practical tips for you to go away as a bit of homework and look at within your own organization. One is encryption. So many incidents are much less serious because encrypted data at rest and in transit means that even if it's intercepted, it can't be exploited. Often it's the difference between having to notify a breach at all or not. Secondly, backups. If you've got regularly maintained backups and if you're using them effectively, that can make an enormous difference in the event of a breach, to be able to restore information, or even sometimes circumvent sort of ransomware if you can make a clean install, or you can run on a sort of disaster recovery sort of backup version of your systems. And then thirdly, and this is a very sort of technical point, but ports. Mark made a comment about open ports, and I've now just in the last few months seen 2 incidents where an IT consultant has left a port open while they were working on a server and introduced a vulnerability into otherwise a very secure system, and that vulnerability has been exploited in one case within hours by a sort of web crawler robot that the hacker was just using to probe random ports to see whether they were open, and before they knew it, they were in and had got their hands on the data. So those are just 3 very specific things to go away and think about and see whether they they're being properly implemented within your business. If there are any other questions of a legal nature, do of course feel free to reach out to me whenever. I'm sure that our contact details will be circulated following on from this session. And in the same way, if you've got any sort of questions at all about insurance and the approach to sort of cyber risk from the commercial side, Mark's your guy for that. And I'm sure he'll be very happy to talk to you further and answer any sort of questions that you might have. Thanks everyone for coming along. It's been really good. Thanks for all your interesting and thought-provoking questions, and we'll hope to see you soon.
Thanks everybody.